This is LOGOS, a functional biblical Greek course. My name is John Johnson. I am introducing myself for the sake of the people who will be listening online. For those of you who are in this course, that is very repetitive because you already know me quite well. All right, so let's get into it. This is going to be just an introduction. Okay, nothing too terribly horrendous, mostly background material, that sort of thing. Okay, so don't take it overly serious. Please don't. There will be some of you who will have a propensity to try to write out notes on top of notes. Don't do that. I have provided notes to you guys. All you have to do is fill in the blank. For those of you who are watching online, I put links in the description box. Go there to get them. Use those notes. Don't try to write it all out yourself. Make it easy for yourself, okay? There's no reason to beat yourself up about this. All right. First of all, a disclaimer. This may come as a shock to you, but I am not an expert in biblical Greek. I studied on my own a while ago, and I have probably forgotten more than most people will ever know. Actually, if you just learn the Greek alphabet, you'll know more than most people will ever know. Okay. So why are you in this class? Or for the people who are online, why are you listening to this? Well, because my expertise is free, whereas most other people will charge you. Okay, let's just be honest about that. Okay, you guys only had, for you, those of you who are in class here, you guys only had to pay for the cost of your materials. If you go to a seminary, even if you're just taking a jammed from class, you're talking usually at least hundreds of dollars for what you get here. But fortunately, with the way that Koine Greek scholarship is these days, you can get materials really cheap as long as you have someone, you know, who's been through it, who can kind of show you the ropes, which you don't have with Biblical Hebrew and you don't have with most other languages. So Koine Greek is the way to go if you want to learn a language. All right, and then if I'm not an expert, guess what that means about you guys? You're not going to be experts either. Okay, I know that might come as a shock to you guys, but this will not make you an expert or anything even close to one. Okay, so please do not wind up taking this course, say, I studied Greeks for 10 weeks, now I am perfect. You are not. Okay, you will not be an expert, you will not know everything, contrary to your own opinion of yourself. That is one thing that actually really annoys me is, you know, I've been, you know, studying Biblical Greek for a long time on my own, and I'm learning new things all the time. And it just shocks me when I talk to people who, whether they just got out of seminary or they're studying it on their own, and they've been through 2 weeks and they think that they know everything already. And it's just sitting there going, you haven't even scratched the surface yet. You know, I like to use the analogy of a sphere. You know, you put a little dot on the sphere, that's usually what you wind up learning in a course like this. The circle of the sphere, not the entire sphere, but the circle of the sphere is what you'll probably wind up learning in a lifetime. The sphere itself in 3 dimensions, that's everything that is available to learn. Okay, don't get cocky. And then, for this slide, lastly, if you want to please God with what little you will learn, you must study with humility and patience. Okay, there is no room for pride in the study of biblical languages. We're talking about God's word. We're talking about God's message. It's not ours. We don't get to decide what it means. If you're here because you want to discover something new, and you want to see what it really means, when most of the time it's exactly the same as what it says in English, you're in it for the wrong reasons. Okay, this is so that we can more ably handle the Word of God, and so that when we talk to other people about it, we can do it with a better understanding of what is there. Not to show off, not to say, hey, look at me, all those kinds of things. The only proper attitude before the God of the Bible is one of humility. And if you're going to understand it well, that means you're going to have to take your time. Okay. I had a student when I was in college. I did math tutoring and for the college students. And there was one kid who would fit the definition of legally retarded. And he was trying to learn math, and not just any math. He wanted to know calculus. And you're sitting there with this kid who's, you know, just about as low on the intelligence pool as you can think of. And frankly, my opinion at that time was not all that high. I didn't have high hopes for him learning that much. But he would take the course, and he would fail. And he would take the course, and he would fail. And he kept plugging along, failing multiple times until one time he finally passed. And he took the course again, the one that he passed, because he wanted a better grade. And he eventually got to the point where he knew Calculus 2, which is the weed-out class for the math series. If you can't get past Calculus 2, you can't do anything in math in college. He got through Calculus 2 with a B+, eventually. I don't like it when people tell me that they can't learn something. If you spend enough time, you can learn it. It's just a matter of having enough time. So if you don't get it in the 10 weeks that we have here, don't kill yourself about it. Give yourself time. Fair enough?
Fair enough.
That's good.
All right. Moving on, disclaimer done. Let's get into the fun details. Now, for about like the rest of this, I'm going to sit here geeking out in front of you all. So if I get carried away and I start getting too long about something, say, you know, we've been on this slide for like 30 minutes. We should probably not be on a slide for 30 minutes. You know? Yeah, exactly. So please curtail me if I start talking too long about something, because the rest of this it's fun for me, but it isn't necessarily fun for everyone else, especially when you have things to do. All right. So, biblical Greek. First rule in class, in biblical Greek classes, we don't say biblical Greek, because it isn't really. It's actually Koine Greek. Koine. Okay. It's Koine Greek, and before Koine Greek was Attic Greek. And this is not something you store on the top of your house, just in case you're wondering. Okay.
Not in the top of my head.
Hopefully somewhere in your head. All right, now how is it that we got to the point where the Bible, especially the New Testament, is being given in Koine Greek? How did that happen? Because when we normally think of the biblical people in biblical times and biblical location, we're thinking about the Israelites. And when we think of the Israelites, we don't usually think of Greek. So how did that happen? It's a good question, right? Well, hopefully it's a good question. Well, go back a little bit in time to the 4th century BC, and we encounter a very important figure in history. His name was Alex. And Alex had this weird thing where he thought that the Persians were all a bunch of wimps and that he could prove it. So he gathered a very well-disciplined army and basically wiped all their armies out. He went through Persia, he went through what is now modern-day Israel, he went through Egypt. He also got into Asia as far as India. Just conquering as he went, and everywhere he went, he took his Greek culture with him. And that is how the Greek language spread to all of these different lands. Now that was all the way back in the 4th century. The New Testament, of course, occurs in the 4th century, so you have literally hundreds of years where these people are being exposed to this language, where the language becomes ordinary, normal usage. But there's one weird thing about conquest when it comes to language. When you have a group that invades you and says, you have to learn our language, and you have to learn it quickly, the odds of you speaking their language fluently is about 0. If it's a language of conquest, you learn enough so that they don't kill you, is usually what winds up happening. And you're going to wind up learning that language through the lens of your own. So what happens is they bring their language in, and you, being the guys that are occupied, you're going to modify it based on your own experiences, based on how quickly you had to learn it, things like that. And that's exactly what Koine Greek is. It is the Attic Greek being applied to people that are subjugated by the Greek Empire. And so Koine Greek compared to Attic Greek is kind of like comparing formal American English with the English that's spoken by someone who's been in the country for 2 to 3 years. If someone's been in this country for 2 to 3 years, they're going to know the language enough to carry on a conversation, right? But it's not going to be formal. They're going to say some things that are just going to sound weird to you. And it's not going to seem like it's in the right order sometimes. Have you ever been in a conversation like that? Yeah. And that's kind of how Koine Greek is. It's a fully communicable language, but it doesn't have the same rigid structure that Attic Greek had. Instead, it's the common ordinary form. And it actually kind of acts like what is called a pidgin or a Creole form, which is basically what I've been describing, something that's been adopted by one group, but it's not really theirs. That's what a pidgin or Creole form basically is. And that's essentially what Koine Greek is. But this creates a little bit of a problem. If you have a group of people that this language has been thrust on them, they're not going to typically care where any of the words came from. And they don't really care what the words historically meant. It's just, does this get across a meaning now that we can communicate with? So if you try to look up the roots of these Greek words, and you study, and you look back and say, well, in the time of Homer, this meant this. Well, that's great, fine, and wonderful, but this isn't the time of Homer, and this is not Greek people. These are people who didn't really want to have this language in the first place, kind of thing. So they're not going to use it conventionally. And that's the error of rootism. When people look at where a word came from and they assume that that's how it's being used later on. That's not valid thinking, but lots of people do it. And especially in Bible studies. They'll say, well, I looked up this word and I discovered that its roots were this, and so what it really means has nothing to do with it. Those people didn't care about the roots. That language was forced on them and they just used it as they saw fit. You don't want to do the rootism thing. That's a major error, and it's very dangerous to think that the word has basically meant the same thing throughout all that time. Words change with time. Take the English word cool, for example. Look it up in an older dictionary. It will tell you that it is low in temperature. Go out on the streets and a kid will look at you and say, hey, mister, you're not very cool. You're not very low in temperature, you know? Thank you for telling me I'm hot. Thank you so much. Yep. That's not exactly what those kids mean by that, though, because the word has shifted in meaning. So looking up its root meaning, its historical meaning, isn't going to give you much help. And the same thing occurs with Koine Greek. So if you look up the roots of a Koine Greek word, great for you. It has absolutely no bearing on what the Bible means, though. Fair warning. All right, now let's take a look. Actually, before I go on, I should ask you guys, are you guys done filling in the blanks here?
Except for D.
Except for D?
Yeah, that's not there yet, though. Okay, it's probably after the next picture.
Oh, okay.
Yep, okay.
Okay.
All right, so wanted you guys to get a little bit of an image of what the Greek Empire looked like at its height during Alexander's conquest. As you can see, it is a massive landmass. Let me see if I can bring up a pen here. I love my pen. I love my pen. So here's modern-day Greece. And the Greeks kept getting attacked by the Persians, and the Greeks pretty quickly realized that the Persian army wasn't all that, a lot of bluster, we'll put it that way. They talked a big talk, and they had a massive army, but they were not very well trained and not very well disciplined, and the Greeks are sitting there going, I bet you we can take them. So they did. They captured Asia Minor. That went pretty easily. Captured Mesopotamia. That worked out pretty easily. Israel was pretty much not on the map as far as providing any kind of a fight. Egypt wasn't very difficult either. And then Alexander got all the way pretty much right up to India. That's what this is right here. Pretty much got all the way up to India before he finally died. It was a relatively short-lived empire because it was mostly Alexander that was behind it, but while it was there, it burned very furiously. And it took Greek into all these places. It became very common in those places. So common, in fact, that by the time we get to the 1st century here in Israel, they discovered something really interesting with the ossuaries. Does anyone know what an ossuary is before I use that word? Heard of the word? Okay, so I probably should define that first. Ossuary is a bone box. The Hebrews didn't bury people in caskets like we use. Instead, what they would first do is they'd take the dead body of the person who died, they'd lay them in the tomb, just out in the open, let them decay, which is kind of gross to think about. So when the Bible talks about not letting the Holy One see decay and whatnot, that kind of gives you a little different idea. Let the body decay until you basically had just bones left, and then you'd gather up the bones and put them in a bone box called an ossuary. And once it finally got to that point, which would usually be sometime down the road, because you'd have to let them decay first, then they would inscribe the bone box with some kind of an inscription to let you know who this was, and then they would get put in the back of the tomb. So they had the laying out tables in the front of the tomb, bone boxes went in the back once they were in a more compact form, we'll put it that way.
I take up now.
Exactly. And what's weird is they have done archaeological digs of these ossuaries from 1st century Jerusalem, and they actually found out that in some places, 2/3 of the bone boxes, 2/3 of the ossuaries had Koine Greek inscriptions on them. That would be like going to a town here in America and say all the people who died from 1800 to 1900 in this particular town and finding out that all of the tombstones were written in French. What does that tell you about that particular town at that time? A lot of people were speaking French, right? Well, that's what they found in Jerusalem at the time. In the 1st century, Koine Greek was actually a common language to be spoken. When we think of it, we think of Hebrew, we think of Aramaic, but the historical fact is that they were actually most commonly speaking Greek. So it actually kind of makes sense that we get the New Testament in Greek. It's what everyone was speaking. Hebrew became basically the language of the religious elites. It was the religious language. It wasn't a common language. There was Aramaic, which was kind of like the language that was spoken in the home, but it wasn't the marketplace language. The marketplace language was Koine Greek. There was also the legal language, which was Latin, because by this time the Roman Empire had eventually invaded. But the common marketplace language that if you're going to do anything on a normal day-to-day basis with people, it's going to be Greek. So it's not surprising at all that we get that material.
There's the Koine Greek, right?
Yeah, the Koine Greek becomes the common form.
Okay.
All right, let's move on from there. Pretty pictures. Pretty pictures. All right, D. Since Koine Greek has fewer hard and fast rules than Attic or Classical Greek, Classical was before Attic, context is the primary standard of interpretation. It doesn't have a lot of hard and fast rules in and of itself. So if you want to figure out what it means you're going to be analyzing context a lot. Koine Greek is a very contextual language, meaning that you can't take just a sentence by itself and expect to get a whole lot out of it. You have to know what's been coming up to it, and you have to know what flows out of it. It's a very contextual language, and this is another problem I have with people. They decide that they want to do a sermon on just one verse, and you're sitting there going, there's kind of more on the page there, but they want to take that one verse and they run with it, and they do all this interpretation and say, well, it could mean this and it could mean that. It's like, I'm pretty sure that the author didn't have, insert your own meaning here in mind. Instead, there's stuff that led up to it that would guide your understanding, and stuff that follows from it that guides your understanding. And when we interpret the text, we need to do it the same way. Context is the first rule of interpretation. The second rule is very similar. It is also context. The third rule, you might guess, is also context. So what do you guys think the major rule of interpretation is?
Context.
Wow, you guys are so awesome. It's like they're paying attention or something. I have no idea how that happened. I'm sorry about that. I failed as a teacher. All right, so context is what you guys are primarily going to be going for. Keep that in mind. Please keep that in mind. Now, Koine Greek also tends to have a simpler vocabulary than a lot of other languages. Like I said, it's kind of a Creole pidgin form. Think of someone who's been speaking a language for 2 to 3 years, what kind of vocabulary they're going to have. They're typically going to use the same set of words, but in lots of different ways, because those are the only words they know, right? Koine Greek is very much like that. The total vocabulary of Koine Greek was something around 5,500 words for the New Testament, which is actually small for a language. English, by comparison, is about, for the average user, somewhere between 20 and 60,000, depending on who you're talking about. Some people as low as 10. They're usually the ones that don't do very well in high school. But usually an English speaker will know somewhere between 10 and 60,000 words, usually at least 20,000. Koine Greek, 5,500 is the total number of words, but most of those don't get used very often. There's 270 words that actually wind up making up 75% of the text. 270 words, you will know 3/4 of the words that you see in the Greek New Testament. That's pretty cool. It makes it really easy for you guys, because I'm going to give you guys word lists, and you want to bet which words are on that list? Yeah.
270.
Yeah, that 270. Now, like I said, you don't have to necessarily memorize it, but I'm going to give it to you guys to familiarize yourselves with it. I would suggest that you read through the list once a day. Once we get there, we're not anywhere close to that yet, because you guys don't even know the alphabet. But once we get there, read through the list so you'll be at least minimally familiar with it. And since these words are being used all the time, it means that they're going to be used in lots of different ways. They have a multitude of, like we said before, context-dependent meanings. For instance, the BDAG, which is a lexicon, which is a fancy way of saying Greek dictionary. The BDAG, which is kind of the Rolls-Royce of Greek lectionaries, records over 20 different meanings of the preposition dia. That's a lot of different definitions. Now, given that it's a preposition, that's actually not all that surprising. Prepositions tend to get used in lots of different ways. What's more surprising to me is that the same source also lists 18 different uses of theos, and theos is a noun or an adjective. You usually don't have 18 different meanings for a noun or adjective. But in Koine Greek, you do. Interestingly, though, we usually translate this word, even though it has 18 different uses, we usually translate it the same way every single time. Any guesses as to what that might be? No, that's fine. Theos is the same root as theology, which is the study of God. So theos is God. Yeah, pretty much every single time we translate it, we usually translate it with God, but it's actually used 18 different ways in the New Testament.
Okay, so that's that word there again.
Yep, theos.
That's theos, and that's basically God.
Yep.
Okay.
It's not theos. Theos. Theos.
Theos.
Kind of like the Oz, but not. That's actually a really bad connotation. I shouldn't have even used that. I thoroughly apologize for that one. And for everyone who's listening online, I also apologize to you too. All right, do we have the blanks filled in on that one? Are you sure, Mac?
I got it. I'm just kind of making a note.
Oh, okay. Are you doing what I said not to do? He's making notes on top of notes and beside notes.
I'm doing it.
I just figured out what you were talking about as to where that word was. It was right there.
Ah.
Theos.
I know that's
Yep.
Theos.
Theos. Yeah.
Theos.
Yes. We usually translate it as God. Like I said, properly it doesn't actually technically mean that. It has 18 different meanings, but it's easier to translate it as just God.
Is that God proper or God in general?
It, like I said, it has lots of different uses, and it doesn't necessarily mean supernatural beings either, which is another major problem when translating it. Yeah, it would actually be, in my opinion, a little bit more properly translated as Great One, which can be referred to humans, it can refer to angels, it can refer to spiritual entities property. It can refer to entities that are thought to be great, in the case of idols and things like that. To me, that would be a little bit more appropriate translation, but that's not what people in English are used to, so we use God. And that's one thing that you have to think about when you're translating is, okay, here's what it technically means right here. The question is anyone actually going to understand that? A lot of times, no. So even though you sit there and say, well, technically it kind of has this nuance, you also have to consider nobody really cares about that nuance. All right, so moving on. The texts of early Christianity. During the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, the Hebrews had already begun to translate their writings into Koine Greek. So 4th century, Alexander the Great has a great military campaign taking over pretty much everything in the area. And then we get to a century or two later, and Koine Greek has become so common by this point that the Hebrew people, a good portion of them, are no longer speaking Hebrew very commonly. They're speaking Koine Greek. And so the leaders get together and they say, we might want to actually have our scriptures in a language that the ordinary person can understand. And so they translate it. It started with what is called the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. It started there and eventually extended to all the books of the Old Testament and what are called the ecclesiasticals. This is where the important question of what on earth is an ecclesiastical comes into mind. Anyone ever heard that term before? That's probably a new term for you guys, right?
I've heard it.
You've heard it. It's mostly because you hang out with me, though. Okay. Yeah, an ecclesiastical is something that is used by a religious community, but it's not necessarily of authority. It could have authority or it could not be authoritative. Its important distinction is that it's just simply used by that group. So, for example, with the Hebrew people, they would, of course, use the Torah. That would be the most authoritative for them. They would also have the books of the prophets. That would also still be authoritative, but not as authoritative as the Torah. Then they would have the writings, which would include things like Psalms and some books like that. A lot of the wisdom literature would be in the writings. And that would be authoritative, but not as much. And then they had this entire other group of writings that were just really not all that authoritative, but it was still an important part of their culture and their history, like books like 1st and 2nd Maccabees, Judith and Tobit, books that we would usually call the Apocrypha. So ecclesiasticals is this term that envelops everything. The authoritative stuff and the not authoritative stuff. Very big word. And so all of those together, in their Greek form, are called the Septuagint. And if you say gent, I'm going to be very disappointed in you. I'm looking at one person in particular.
I could be like, so what? What is it again then?
Septuagint. Septuagint. That is because in Greek there is no hard J sound, so there is no jint. It's gint.
And I Americanize it when I say it. So
Yes.
I'll try to be nice during this. So.
Thank you.
Pronounce
Thank you.
Like Dr. White does. Christian today.
Yes, yes, I do. He keeps using the Latin form, even though he's a Greek teacher, which just annoys me. All right, but that is really neither here nor there. Don't hang up on that. That's a personal hang up. Yep, Septuagint means the 70, and that's how many translators supposedly started it off when we were talking about the Torah. When the first translations were done, it was just of the Torah, and supposedly there were 70 translators who worked on that. And that's the name that stuck. Whether or not that's historically true, we don't really know. It probably did start with, there's a good reason to believe that it actually probably did kind of start that way, but there's lots of stories that developed afterwards that got kind of crazy. There were people who were saying, well, there was these 70 translators. It was technically actually 72, but they would round it. But they had these 70 translators, and they put them 2 by 2 into little cubicles and asked them to translate the Torah, the first 5 books. And they translated it, and they got together, and then when they compared notes, they found that they're all perfectly the same, which means that God blessed the translation of the Septuagint. It is the perfect, inspired translation. There were KJV onlyists back then. They just didn't have the KJV.
They were Septuagint onlyists.
Yeah, Septuagint onlyists. Yeah, those stories are surely apocryphal, but the idea that it started with the Torah is very reasonable. If the Jews are going to translate something, it's going to be the Torah first. That makes sense. And that they would have used a number close to 70 would make sense just historically, because there was the 70 elders that Moses had. There was the 70 in the Sanhedrin, things like that. It's a number that they were used to for ruling things. So that part of it is probably pretty accurate. The whole story about them going into separate booths and all coming together with the exact same translation is probably not historically correct at all.
Sounds kind of Mormonish.
And then there's that.
Yes.
All right, now this is just for fun, but here on the page we have a manuscript, and this of course is not in your notes because it's not really relevant to anything. This is me geeking out. Like I said, this is going to happen. Okay, so this is me geeking out. This is one of the Jewish Greek manuscripts that we have. This is not a Christian manuscript, but it's written in Greek, and it's from the Hebrews. And we know it's from the Hebrews because of a very particular feature. This right here is the name of God. In Hebrew, you would say Yahweh. In Greek, they either transliterate it as Yahweh, because they can't say way in Greek. They just don't, it doesn't pronounce. So it's either Yahweh, transliterating it across, or they'll actually translate it into a different word, Kyrios. And they always write it out all the way. They never abbreviate it. Okay, so if it's a Jewish manuscript, a Hebrew manuscript, when it comes to the name of God, they're always going to write it out, either transliterated or completely translated out, but it's never going to be abbreviated, it's never going to be shortened. Mm-hmm. That's how you know it's a Hebrew manuscript. They never abbreviated the name of God. So what do you think that Christians did with it?
What do we do with it?
Yeah, with the name of God. If the Jews always wrote it out, what do you think made us different?
We abbreviated, because that's what we do.
We abbreviated it, yes. Yeah, we abbreviated it. And that's what the next one is about. Oh, by the way, I did want to draw attention to the name. That is an awesome name for a manuscript right there. 4Q120. Just rolls right off the tongue.
Yeah. Doesn't it?
Uh-huh. I just love the way they name Greek manuscripts. It's interesting.
So why do we shorten it?
That is a very important thing, and we'll get to that in a second here.
Americans shorten everything.
Well, it's not Americans. It was just Christians.
Oh.
Okay.
It's not just the English part of it.
Yeah. All right, so, yep. So here's what the Christians did with it. Okay, so the early Jews, they're translating things into Greek. Christians, when they come on the scene, they're going to start making their own copies of these documents as well. They take their own copies of the Old Testament, so they have their own version of the Septuagint, and of course they have their New Testament documents as well. And in them, they use this thing called nomina sacra. Nomina sacra, which means sacred names. The order's different because it's Latin, but it means sacred names. And eventually in time, this became an abbreviation system that wound up including like everything in its dog. They would abbreviate the word David and Jerusalem and lots of common ordinary words. So it just became an abbreviation system, kind of a shorthand, if you will. But initially, it was reserved for a very particular set of words. It was reserved for the Greek word for God, theos, we already discussed that. Kyrios for Lord, Jesus for Jesus, Christos for Christ, pneuma for Spirit, and staros for cross. Those in the earliest manuscripts that we have are the only words that were abbreviated. What do all of those words have in common?
Deity.
Deity or relevance to salvation,
Oh.
like with the cross.
Okay.
Which is a very interesting mindset. They believe that all members of the Godhead were involved in salvation in one way, shape, or form, and that they were all equally God. So it didn't matter if you were talking about Jesus or the Spirit, they were God too. So the Christian mindset from the very beginning was that our God is complex. He's not like us. We are one being, one person. God is not like us. He is a multitude of persons in a single being. And that was the understanding of Christians from the very beginning. And so they used these abbreviations to get that point across. This is deity. This is someone who is not like us. That's why we did that. Which isn't to say that the Hebrews didn't have respect for the name of God. They did. But Christians were making a very specific and emphatic point. We saw God in the flesh in front of us. We experienced the Holy Spirit in a way that you guys haven't experienced the Holy Spirit. We experience these things. We know that they are all God, unquestionably so. And they made sure that they put that point right into the manuscripts. This is what we've experienced that you guys haven't. You guys haven't experienced the revelation of the Messiah like we have. You haven't experienced the revelation of the Holy Spirit like we have.
And so that's why they shortened it?
That's why they shortened it, was to draw attention to it.
Oh.
These are all in the same category is basically what they're saying.
Okay.
So, for example, the manuscript that is on this one is Codex Aleph. That rolls right off the tongue too, doesn't it? Yeah. That's actually a Hebrew letter, but it's used for a Greek manuscript, which is really confusing. Mm-hmm. And not only is it Codex Aleph, but it actually has a proper name because it's shown up in history a few times. It's called Codex Sinaiticus, but it's Codex Aleph, but it's Greek. It's just, yeah, the way that things get named in history is just all kinds of weird.
And you have the Codex.
Yes, I have a facsimile of it. Okay. I do not have the original. The British Library is very, very happy to know that I do not have it.
I'm stuck in there one day.
You guys left it unguarded. I'm sorry. No, I have a facsimile edition of it. Yes. Yeah, very important early Christian manuscript, but it has nomina sacra all over in it. And this is a page from Leviticus in Codex Sinaiticus. And you can see here a couple of the abbreviations. The first letter looks like a K. Technically it's Kappa, but it's K. It has the same sound too. And then the next letter, it looks like a C, but it's actually an S sound. It's sigma, so KS kind of. But that was the abbreviation for Kyrios, what we would usually translate as Lord. Instead of writing it out in full as Kyrios, they would abbreviate it to say, this is one of those special things. This is something we want to draw attention to. Now, like I said, eventually in time, this abbreviation system wound up including everything in its dog, like the words David and Jerusalem and things like that. But initially, it was just for this set of words.
Just focusing on the Godhead
and salvation.
Related to that.
Yeah. Okay. All right, so questions about this one? No. Mac is over there thinking really hard, going, I still can't figure out what that letter is.
I know. I'm not focusing on that yet. Because that doesn't look like curious to me. It looks like hypio. Hypio. Yeah, there we go. Yes. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, you'll learn about the Greek alphabets in actually the next lesson after this one. So, and you'll get to figure out why Y has become kind of like U sounds and C's or S's and things like that.
Multitarian. Okay, now what was that supposed to be?
Multitarian means that our God is complex in his personhood.
Okay, so.
Whereas the Jews today, because they ignored everything that happened in the New Testament, and also groups like the Muslims and other groups like that, they are what is called Unitarian. They believe that God is simple in his personhood. There's only one person in the Godhead. We are Multitarian. We believe that there are multiple persons in the Godhead. And we've always believed that, because that's what we saw right in front of us. It's kind of hard to ignore it. Yeah, God's walking in and among us. Yeah. A little hard to ignore. One of my favorite commentators likes to say that the New Testament authors were experiential Trinitarians, whereas we are revelationally Trinitarian. We receive it by revelation. They experienced it.
They went through it.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, there you go.
Which is a cool thought to think about. All right, moving on. Christian manuscripts Christian manuscripts, let's start this over again. They were frequently written as codices, which is fancy professor talk for book. So if you talk about Codex Sinaiticus or Codex Vaticanus, what they really mean is book called Sinaiticus and book called Vaticanus. And what they were these documents that were written on both sides of the page, which was a weird thing at the time, because at the time they were using scrolls, where you'd only write on one side, basically. And Christians came up with this weird thing where you start writing on both sides. And it's kind of a cool thing because you can get twice as much on a page that way. And early Christians were not rich, so hey, saves you some money. So they started writing on both sides, and they also found out that when you do that on a scroll form, you read on to the end, and then you have to flip the scroll over and come back to the other side, and it was really inconvenient. So they got this idea of, hey, instead of binding all these pages one after the other in succession, let's just bind them all along one edge so it's something you can hold in your hand and just flip through.
That's where books came from.
That's where books came from. Now, we can't be sure that it was actually Christians who invented it, but we do know that Christians certainly popularized it. You look at a lot of the 2nd and 3rd century manuscripts, if it's written on both sides, if it's in a codex form, a book form, it's a Christian manuscript.
Okay.
Yeah. The other people didn't do that. They were still using scrolls. Christians, though, they got smart pretty quickly. So here on the page is a manuscript called P66. It is a 2nd or 3rd century manuscript of the Gospel of John. And this side is the side that would be bound, and then the other side would be free so that you could actually turn the pages. Wonderful technology. We take it for granted today, but at the time, this was cutting-edge technology right here, and Christians were on the cutting edge of it right there. They knew it. They got it. All right, and then as far as New Testament manuscripts are concerned, because that's what we're mostly going to be dealing with here is the New Testament, there are 4 categories. You do not have to memorize these. These are just on there so you have a history of the text. But there were the papyri, which is actually what this manuscript is. It is a papyri manuscript. That's why it's called P66. The P stands for papyri. And papyri kind of had the consistency of a brown paper bag. It was not super sturdy stuff. It was basically plant material that was smushed together and then dried. Not terribly high quality stuff. It disintegrated pretty easily. We have very few papyri manuscripts these days that survive from the early periods. I think we're up to like 132, but the estimates put it into the hundreds of thousands that would have been made in history. So 132 out of hundreds of thousands is not much. They did not survive well.
And usually it's just like fragments.
It's usually fragmentary, yeah.
Just to have a whole page like that would be rare.
Sometimes. There are some papyri manuscripts that come along later that weren't too bad, but
Okay.
yeah, the early ones were usually just little fragments. After those came the uncials. Uncials are a capital form that's not on papyri, usually on some kind of animal hide or something like that, which lasted a lot longer. Some of the longest lasting manuscripts that we have were uncials. There were ones that were written on animal hide. Codex not Vaticanus, but Sinaiticus, for example, is a good example of this. It was written in the 4th century, and it was in active use in the church clear up until the 19th century, before it was finally put into storage for academic use. Yeah.
So say that again?
It was written in the 4th century, and it was active use in the church clear up until the 19th century.
Okay.
That is a long-lasting book. I guarantee you that your books that you got for this class will not last that long. Yeah. Trying to get a book that could be in active use last that long is very difficult. Those things were made to last. They were stubborn.
The animal skin ones, right?
Yeah, the animal skin ones.
Leather would last a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah, right here, sure.
Yeah. I always love it when people say, well, we're just generations and generations and generations behind on what the manuscripts of what the originals were. It's like, do you know how long those manuscripts lasted? There were some manuscripts that were made to last. We're not, 20, 30 generations out. We're at most 2, maybe up to 4 in some cases. We're not many generations out from the originals, contrary to what some people would have you believe. Then after that came the minuscules, and they were called the minuscules because they were the first ones to have mini writing in them, lowercase letters. Up to that point, it was all capital letters, no spaces between words, no punctuation. It was just this long string of capital letters, and that's what you read in. And then they got this idea that, if we put spaces between words and we use capitals and lowercases, it's a lot easier to read. And they were right. And also with minuscules, they started developing cursive as well, which made it faster to write. And so minuscules were produced in mass. They were easy to read and they were easy to write. They produced a ton of them. They were very late in the stream, and so they're not as useful for recovering the original text, but they made them in mass, and Christians like them in mass. Finally, there are the lectionaries, which are the manuscripts that were made for the lections, the lectures of the church. The church would usually have particular lessons on particular days, and there would be a Bible reading to go with it. And so what a lectionary was, is it was basically a listing of all the Bible readings that the church would have for its given days. And so it wasn't usually in order, which was annoying. And it would usually skip a lot of sections because you wouldn't read everything necessarily in an order. But it still contains a lot of the biblical text in there, so they're included as manuscripts. And the two earliest were, of course, the papyri and the uncials. So when people are debating about what form of the text and that kind of thing, those are usually the two groups that come up the most because they're the earliest. All right, huge info dump. Any questions on that?
It's Greek to me.
Greek.
Well, you're in the right class.
Well, now I've got to come back for one of my students. He does not separate any words. It's just a string of letters. So you're behind time, buddy.
You are behind time by literally millennia.
Yeah, back 100 years ago.
Oh, but you'll be talking about the Bible, and that's not.
I will tell him that. It's hungry.
Yeah, sorry.
I'm just telling you, you're right in early centuries ago Greek.
John said
Pretty
when I
good.
was little, I think a lot of little kids do that.
I know what the next word is. I'm just starting.
Made him put his finger down before he started another word.
All right, moving on. Now we get to the fun part, parsing Koine Greek. Yay! Okay, as we've already talked about, those of you who are listening to this course online, we haven't talked about it with you yet, but we already talked about the Greek textbooks a little bit. Our primary textbooks are going to be coming from a fellow by the name of Mounts, who's very well known in the world of teaching Greek. He basically cornered the market with really, 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 really cheap, inexpensive, and very useful resources. And they are cheap and useful and actually very accurate, so we're going to use them because they work. And that's exactly what it is shooting for, so we will pay him the money. The main thing that we're trying to get at right now is the parsing. In this one right here, the interlinear, there are these parsing codes that occur with each word. Underneath the word, you'll have a number, the GK number, and then you'll have this parsing code that's the string of letters, and it will tell you important things about how the word is being used. Things like, is it being used in the past tense or is it being used in the future tense? Is this singular or is this plural? Things like that. Those are all in the parsing code. Now, I'm not going to make you guys go through and memorize all the morphology, so you need to know how to use the parsing code because that's what allows you to get around that. All right, so any questions about where we're going with that? Not that this was super detailed. You guys in class here kind of knew that we were going that way. All right.
It's so similar to just teaching English grammar.
Pretty much, yeah. Especially for the way you guys are going to be doing it because you're not going to have to remember the morphology.
Yeah.
So, yeah, pretty much.
Correlation.
Okay, what's morphology, how it came to be?
No, morphology is basically how it looks, the form. That's when something morphs, it changes form.
Okay.
So morphology is how it changes form. For example, the difference between cat and cats. You change the form, you add an S to the end. That's a morphological change.
Okay.
It also tells you whether it's singular or it's plural. Greek has similar things that go on. We're not going to get into the nuts and bolts of it because you're going to be sitting there going, and in 10 weeks you're not going to have enough to go through it all. So we're just going to come out and say this one's singular, okay? This one's plural, okay? All right, so getting into a little bit more detail here. In order to get much from this course, you will have to learn that parsing code. You will have to learn at least how to use it. You won't have to memorize it. If you memorize that, I'd be a little worried, to be honest. But I guess you could if you wanted to. But you will at least have to learn how to use it. Meaning that sheet that I gave you guys at the beginning, and for those of you who will be listening online, download the prefatory material, the introductory material, and make sure that you have that sheet. It will be very, very, very handy. The bad thing about parsing codes, I love that you have them because it really shortens the process for people. Makes it so that they don't have to learn morphology and all those things, but the bad thing about it is that it will vary from author to author. That's another reason why our textbooks are both from Mounts and not from one person and somebody else. We're keeping the codes the same because otherwise it gets really confusing. Not all authors do it the same way. I want it to be as consistent as possible. So your books are the same because, first of all, it's the guy who's written everything in the market anyways, and he's at least consistent across the board in how he does his parsing. So it's useful. All right, and as I mentioned, a chart explaining how the code works can be found at the beginning of your copy of the LOGOS cipher, which you all have in front of you. For those of you online, download it. It will be in the description box. And then also on page 6, introductory page 6 of Mounts into Linear, he also gives something that's very similar to this chart. I personally don't like the way he breaks it down, though, because it's not as succinct across. Instead, it's, okay, if it's here, then it's there, and it's kind of all over the place. It's kind of scatterbrained in my opinion. But it works for him, so it might work for you. I don't know. But yeah, on page 6, introductory page 6, he does have a chart as well. I just don't think it's as good of a chart. Yeah, let me, I think, Debbie, you've got it there.
Abbreviations.
Yeah, I think so.
I know my Roman numerals.
There you go.
I'm taking a Greek course.
Yep, there. Exactly. Yeah, abbreviations is how he titles it.
Okay.
Yeah, that is his way of doing the chart. Like I said, I don't like it, but if you guys find it more useful for you, go ahead and use it. It's not going to be any different. It's the same thing. Yep. All right, for now, you need to focus on knowing how the code works. For example, the code N, so if you go to the first column of your chart, you'll have type, the type of word that it is, and you go down to where you find N, and that means noun. That's all that you need to know for right now, is that it codes for nouns. You don't have to know what a noun is, you just need to know that N means noun. Eventually we'll have to talk about what a noun is, but for right now, I'm not really worried about that.
Which is about fourth graders, you tell us an idea.
Yeah. All right, so questions about this slide? Do we need more time copying it?
Yeah, I don't think I've got it on.
Do you have an example of an instance that would be a noun?
A noun?
Yeah.
Okay. Instance is a noun.
No, never mind. I read it wrong. Sorry.
Yeah.
I read or instance, and I'm like, what's an instance is a noun? Okay, now I get it.
An example.
Yes, for instance, yeah. I know. I leave off letters apparently. Sorry.
Okay.
Yep, and then there are those students where one is the one always whispering to the other one, what did he say? And the other one said, I don't know. Yeah. When I was first started teaching, that actually used to really annoy me, and then after a while you just kind of get used to it. It's like, that's the way it's going to be with some people. It's,
They don't follow along very well.
yeah. Well, sometimes it's,
Alrighty.
yeah.
I don't know.
I don't know.
Well, you're talking about multiple things at one time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Chewing them all across the board, yeah.
Well, exactly. Yeah, and that's why over time I just kind of settled on the whole thing of, you know, some people are just going to take a different way to get there. And as long as they end up at the same bridge that I'm crossing, I'm okay. You might take a different path to get there, but as long as we're crossing the same bridge, we're okay. All right, ready to move on?
Yes. You betcha.
Perfect. All right, so Mounts' parsing code has 5 sections. You'll see them across the top. The first one is the type. So the very first thing that you'll see in the parsing code will always be the type. And it gives you the list there. I won't necessarily go through all of it because I'd just be reading things off a list, which is not fun. And then there are those students with phones.
Don't turn their phones off.
You need to take your phone.
Actually, I used to do that with my high school students. I had a little box at the front and say, okay, everyone put your phones in here, and then I'd close up the box for the lesson, and then after we were done, I'd open back up the box and they could grab it.
This time of night.
It's usually the way it goes. It's usually the way it goes. When you least expect it, that's when someone decides, hey, I wonder how Mac is doing. Yeah. And then the next one is the tense voice mood section. And it basically only relates to verbs. If you're talking about the tense voice mood section, it's a verb. Case number gender has to do with everything that relates to nouns, including adjectives, pronouns, determiners, those kinds of things. It all kind of falls into the noun category. And then interestingly, in kind of a very strange way, it also relates to prepositions. Prepositions are weird in Greek because unlike everything else, almost everything else, they never change form. They will always basically look the same. Now, sometimes it changes depending on if they're followed by a vowel or something like that. But they basically always have the exact same form. But they almost never have the exact same meaning. What determines what they mean is the case, number, gender that follows them, and particularly the case. That's why it says only case here. Okay, so prepositions are case-bound. If you want to know what the preposition means, you have to know what the case is. This is why I feel sorry for people who study something in Strong's Concordance and think that they now suddenly understand Greek. You know, they looked up the preposition and said, well, it must mean this because I want it to. And they don't realize that prepositions are case-bound. It's the case that determines what it means. You can't just look up the definition and choose the definition you like best. That's not how the language works. It depends on the case. All right, person number. That is either going to be something dealing with pronouns or with verbs, which weirds a lot of people out to start with. Because it turns out that in Greek verbs, there's always an implied pronoun, and that's why the two are linked together. So pronouns and verbs are actually kind of linked. Okay. And you will get sentences in Greek that are nothing but verbs.
Wow.
They have implied pronouns with them, and so we can translate them into a proper English sentence. But as far as grammatical construction is concerned, they're all verbs.
There's no noun, verb, adjective.
No, it's just verb, 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 verb. Doing, 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 all the way down. Now, they have implied pronouns, and so you can translate it, but yeah, Greek is interesting that way. It's very, very, very much so a verbal language. And then degree applies only to adjectives and to adverbs. And it's these words that have the AD leading on them in English, just in case you're wondering how to remember that. If it's an add something, you have to worry about degree. And degree is whether it's better or best. That's what degree is.
Oh.
Yeah, comparative, superlative, yes. Yeah, that's what degree is.
Better, best, da, da, da.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so those are the 5 sections. Okay, and you'll notice that in your chart, you have these big, thick bars. Those big, thick bars separate those sections out for you. Now, not every word is going to have everything, obviously. You know, the determiners, nouns, adjectives, pronouns, those all do not have tense voice mood. So when you're looking at the code, don't think that it's going to be there because it won't be there. Okay, that section will basically not exist in the code. You'll just skip right over to the next one and start going from there.
Okay, say that again.
All right, so there's 5 sections altogether. But when you're actually looking at it in the book, there's only going to be 3 sections maximum. And they'll skip the ones that don't apply to those words.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Now let's work on our first translations. These translations will be very, 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 very short, but they will be entire verses. First task, 1 Thessalonians 5:16. Let's go ahead and look it up. 1 Thessalonians, if you get to Revelation, you went too far. 1 Thessalonians 5:16. And in the book, you'll want to look in the middle of the page there in the interlinear. And it should be kind of on the right-hand side towards the bottom.
Rejoice.
Oh, it's 2 words.
It's 2 words, yeah.
It's a good one.
Yep.
Yay.
Okay. And make sure that in the text you can find the 2 words and also all the coding stuff that goes with them underneath. So, okay, so let's wait for everyone to make sure that they have those 2 words and that they can find the numbers underneath. You should find one word that has the coding number 4121.
It's a big joke, man. I want some help. Oh, there's 16. There it is.
Yeah.
Oh, so there's your little top word. There's your top word. Tote, Navatote. Oh, I can assume it's an N. Okay.
516.
Probably not.
Just waiting for people to find them.
I got him.
And I'm not talking to you guys when I say that. I'm talking to people online
Oh, gotcha.
because they're going to wonder why there's all this dead air. They're like, "What happened? Did they forget about us?" No, we're not forgetting about you. We're just doing the mechanical part of it. We're looking through pages and stuff like that.
So what do we need to write down?
You
Oh, we're
don't
not writing down.
not writing down anything right now. You just need to find in the text 516 and make sure that you can find the number code and then the parsing code.
Okay. One of them doesn't have a parsing code. Wait a minute.
We're writing down the 2 numbers? Is that what the parsing code is the 2 numbers?
Right now we're just finding it on the page. So if you can find these 2 words on the page, the number under them and the codes under them, you've accomplished the task so far.
Got it. Trying to do it solid. Yeah. No.
Be patient with yourselves.
So they changed it from always to now.
Yeah. And the big thing to make sure that is you can find those number codes that should match the ones that are on the screen. Make sure that you have the ones that have the 4121 and the 5897.
Okay, there's another number there though.
And you might...
It's under the word just rejoice.
Yeah.
Okay. Now that is because of how the interlinear works. It puts it into proper English order, so it'll take a word and move it over from what the Greek order is. Ignore that. If it doesn't have a Greek word above it, ignore it.
Well, it's got something above it.
It does not have a Greek...
A-I-P-E-T-E. Pronounce that for me.
Where are you?
I'm right here.
All right. Online people, I'm stepping away from the mic. I'm not abandoning you. I'm just checking on something.
Yeah, I know. But I'm also looking right over here, and there's that word in that italics. It's rejoice.
You're only worried about the Greek words. You know that.
Oh, I'm not looking at that first rejoice.
Oh, okay, we're
Oh,
just looking at
gotcha.
the Greek
Yeah,
words.
okay.
Okay, that's,
That, all right.
so we're not worried about.
Yes, just the Greek words.
Because the number
Just
is the
the
same.
Greek
As you
words.
move across, the number is the same. 5897.
Yep, those two. You got them?
Okay, and so it went backwards. Okay, there we
Yeah,
go.
okay.
Yeah, in the interlinear, it'll change things to match English order, which Greek does not follow.
So it's like at all times rejoice.
At all times rejoice.
Is basically what it's trying to. Is
We'll get there in a second.
Okay.
Okay, so we've found it, finally. And I did want to let you guys know what the proper name of those numbers is. It's the Goodrich-Kohlenberger numbers, which none of you will remember, I can guarantee it.
Unless I write it down.
Unless I read it down. Yeah, they're the Goodrich-Kohlenberger numbers. Just call them the GK numbers. Okay, that's fine. Now, in some references, you will see G numbers. Those are Strong's numbers. They do not match up. Strong's numbers and GK numbers are not the same. That's the important thing to remember. Okay, looking up one is not looking up the other. The standard academic ones are the GK numbers. That's what we're going to use. Strong's is not standard academic. Okay. It might be useful for some things, but it's not standard academic. All right, now we're going to go ahead and we're actually going to work with these codes. Let's do the first word first. So, number 1. That's an awful looking 1, but pretend. I know it looks kind of like a 4, but you know. All right, so number 1, it is pantate, which you guys don't have to know yet, so don't worry about it. Pantate. And let's do the parsing first. Parsing means you're going to look up its code in the little chart, and you're going to figure out what that code means. So ADV, look that up in the chart, and what does it mean?
Adverb.
Yeah, it's adverb. It's one of my favorite codes. I like all the single letter codes because they are awesome. Yeah, you always look up type first and look.
ADV, well, of course it's adverb.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, this is making this easy. If it seems easy, that's because it is.
That part I get.
Okay. I know that, yeah.
ADV.
ADV, okay.
Is that under 8?
Well, you need your little paper here. Yes, but it's on this little paper.
Yeah, we need the parsing code
Take the
chart.
little paper out.
And if you guys have those codes memorized already, I'd be very surprised.
Okay, so you look up ADV, so you look up adverb. Okay,
Uh-huh.
there we go.
Yeah, you always look up type first. That's the first column there.
Okay,
That's like part of speech.
Yeah, and a lot of them will stop right at the type. You don't have to know anything more than just the type, because that's all it gives you.
So this one, that's all we need.
That's all it gives you.
Okay.
It only gives you one section. Only use one section, okay? If there's not a period with anything following, you don't have to worry about anything else. It's just the type. That's all you need to know about it. So this is an adverb. And if you look at adverbs and you go across, you'll see the adverbs sometimes have degree, right?
Yes.
But this one doesn't have a period after the ADV with something following, so this one doesn't have degree. It's just a base adverb. It's not saying this is better or best or anything like that. It's just the base form of it.
Okay, so do we need to make that notation about the period then?
No, you guys will learn it as you go along, I guarantee it.
Okay.
What you need to have right now is just write this.
Okay.
The ADV is adverb. That's all you need to know right now. Okay. ADV tells us it's an adverb. We've parsed it. Yay, we're done our parsing job. We're good. So now we know what kind of word it is, which is fantastic, but we don't know what the word means. So now we need to lex the word. Lexing basically means you look up the code and figure out what it means. So we go to the back of the book and we look up the 4121 and we try to figure out what 4121 means. And for those of you who are online, I highly suggest, as I already have multiple times talking about this online, that you actually get the textbook so you can follow along. It makes it a whole lot easier. And no, do not pay me any money. I will take your money, but I will not give you any books. Go buy the books on your own.
Okay, 4121?
Yeah, 4121. What does 4121 mean?
Always at all times.
Ever.
Yep,
When, because that's what an adverb is. When, why, where, and how.
pretty much.
Always at all times.
So 4121 basically means always. In this context it would. And we'll talk about contextual appropriateness more as we go along. Right now I'm telling you, out of that list of definitions, the one that's appropriate is always.
You're telling us what it is, and we'll learn what it is later, right?
I'm telling you where to find the list of possible meanings, and I'm telling you which one specifically applies right now.
This one is the always, okay.
Yeah. All right, now the next word is going to take a little bit more to parse.
Okay,
Okay,
so
so
the parse
is finding the code.
Finding the code. What does the code mean? And then lex means you look up the number.
Lex is the number. Okay, parse is the code.
Mm-hmm.
Parse is the code. And the lex is the number, right?
Exactly.
Okay. I need to have these things written out for me. Okay.
Until I learn them, just like computer directions.
Exactly.
First do this, then do that.
So what?
And after I get it learned, I can put it all in there.
All right, so with the second word, which I do not expect you guys to know how to pronounce yet, but it's kairete. Exactly, right? We'll figure out how to parse it first. So its parsing code is quite a bit longer. It has 3 sections. And like I said, that's the maximum number of sections you're going to see on one of these. So the first part of that is the V. Let's just do that. So V period. What does V mean? And yeah, you go to type, you look up where the V is, and you find that it's a verb. So that's why I have verb here before the period. And then after the P, we have the P, A, and the M. Now, if we follow verb across on the chart, we get a section that has 3 things in it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the section that's going to apply. It's going to be tense, voice, and mood, and we have to figure out which tense it is, which voice it is, and which mood it is.
So it would be the
I don't even know what
present active imperative?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, the P goes for present.
You know, I'm looking at that word and it says aorist. I don't know what that is. P-A-M, Pam.
No. P-A.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah.
P-10.
Every type has its own letters.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. Okay. P-A.
So it's
Present active imperative.
But the verb is, you put a period after the verb though, right?
right.
Write it out. Okay, I didn't see that up there.
Yeah, the periods separate the sections. So the V told us it was a verb. We look on the chart to see what sections apply, and the second section applies tense, voice, mood, so we have to figure out what the tense, the voice, and the mood are. And it turns out that it's present, active, imperative. You guys don't need to know what present, active, imperative is right now, but that's what it is.
And then put a period after that, because that section is done, right?
Right. And then we need the next section. Now in the chart, you'll see that the next section, case number gender, is blank.
Yes.
There are no X's in the case number gender section for verbs.
Okay.
So that means you're going to go on to the one that's after that,
Okay.
which is the person number category.
Okay, so that says 2P, so it would be second plural, right?
Yeah, second person plural.
Okay, second person.
So there's the second person, and then plural.
You okay?
Yeah, I'm fine.
Okay, and that's,
And that's okay. And then it's sitting there.
Okay, so for some of you, this chart will be your lifeline.
I do this in English for some of my kids. Just surprise them one day.
So when
I know
they-
what this word means.
when they write out these parsings, that's why you need this chart to know which ones to help you break things down of what needs to go into.
Yeah, when I translate it into English, I need to know if it's a present tense verb or if it's past tense.
Yeah. So-
I need to know if it's, in the second person or if it's in the first person, things like that. That's what the parsing code tells you. This is not something you're going to get from looking at Strong's Concordance, by the way. It will not tell you if it's first person, second person, plural, whatever.
Okay, but I guess what I'm saying is, how will we know to skip a section from here to here?
This
That's
tells
why
you,
we have to-
that's why you have the chart.
Have to have that, okay.
Yeah, that's why I don't like the chart that Mounts puts in his interlinear, because he doesn't tell you when to skip a section.
Okay,
I laid it out so that the sections that don't apply are blank,
This,
which I find more useful. Not
So,
everyone
yeah.
would though, but
So
I find it more
we
useful.
need this because it could kind of change a little bit with the parsing.
Once you get used to it, it's not so bad. You'll start figuring out that verbs, they're always going to have the first section and usually not much from the second section unless it's a participle. You're going to find patterns as you go along.
Okay.
Okay, but the chart is there as your crutch until you figure out what those patterns are.
My cheat sheet. Okay. Okay.
And then how are you doing, Mac? Are you okay?
Catching on just a little bit here.
You catching on? Do you have any questions for me?
Not right now, I'm just trying to catch up, but I mean,
Okay. And feel free to stop and pause what we're doing if you need more time, because I understand that. It takes time. It does.
so it tells us that it's a term of salutation, of greeting, but that doesn't sound plural to me, unless there's many terms to be used for salutations.
Well, we use the English word salutations, right?
Yeah.
Many greetings to you. Yeah. It's kind of awkward English, especially these days, but we do use that. We do use plural greetings sometimes. We say greetings to you. I don't know if some people say greetings to you. I don't, but yeah, it is something that we could do. But a lot of times it has to do with other things that are in the sentence that will determine those kinds of things. They have to match up.
So that's why this one means rejoice. Besides the fact it just says
Yeah.
rejoice.
Yeah, it'll tell you in the interlinear, but
We haven't gotten to B yet, right?
no, we haven't gotten to B yet. So after you get the parsing code done, you look up 5897, and you look up all the different definitions that are available there. And you're going to pick the one that is contextually appropriate. You guys don't really know how to do that yet, but I'm telling you, rejoice is the appropriate one.
I'll look at 1597 because I want to see what it says. Okay.
And for those of you who are listening online, this is just exciting times right now while we're waiting for people to flip through pages. Hopefully you guys have the pages on your side and you're doing this as well. Otherwise, you're just looking at a screen with red scribbles on it. Congratulations.
So to rejoice, to rejoice, be glad, be joyful, be full of joy. So you want us to
Pick rejoice as being the contextually appropriate definition.
to rejoice, right?
Mm-hmm. And you guys have probably already got this, but what do you think the verse is saying? That would be
Rejoice
appropriate.
always.
Rejoice always, or always rejoice.
Always
I mean, you
rejoice.
could say this a ton of different ways, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to be snarky and I'm going to reverse the order. Not that you guys have to. It's a blank for a reason.
Rejoice always?
Yep.
Okay.
Oh, you stupid thing. I don't want that. Computer.
As long as that's
Yep. Rejoice always.
Huh, isn't that what it said?
Yep.
Yes, it is.
Oh.
Yeah. And this is what
2-word verse.
Yeah, this is what you guys will find with most Greek translations. You look it up in the English, you look it up in the Greek, and guess what? It's the same. I always have people who come up to me and they say, well, what does the Greek really mean here? Pretty much what the English means. Now, there will be times where you'll catch nuances in the Greek that you won't see in the English, where there'll be subtleties involved, and you can go deeper into it. But as far as the basic meanings, they're usually spot on. And if they weren't, relatively accurate, you wouldn't pay for the translation in the first place. So, yeah, as long as it's a decent translation, it's going to get the basic point across just fine.
So when you're looking at Greek, it's more or less for the complex things. We look it up and go, it's simply said, okay, it's simply said. They use that for more, maybe something that's a little more complex.
You're going a little bit deeper than the basic meaning if you're looking it up in the Greek. Or you just want to read it in Greek for some reason.
Yeah.
I'm weird that way. Most people aren't, but
Sometimes I am.
All right, is anyone still writing on this section yet? Can we move on to the next one?
I'm good.
You're good? How about you, Mac? Do you need some more time?
No, I was just reading a little further, but that's fine.
Okay, that's fine.
Good, yeah.
All right, second translation test. You guys will all know this one. And you will love it because you think it's really short in English. It's not as short in Greek, though. It adds one whole extra word to it in Greek. John 11:35. Most of you guys in English would say it how?
Jesus wept.
Jesus wept, yeah. In Greek, it actually turns out to be 3 words.
John 11.
Yep, John 11:35. Adakrusen ha Jesus.
Oh, Jesus is.
I bet you would. All right, so go ahead and look up John 11:35 in your interlinear and make sure that you can find those number codes with the parsing codes underneath them. Okay, and remember, we're only worried about the Greek words. Yes, there will be words on either side for the interlinear. Ignore that. It doesn't matter. Okay, just the Greek words. So,
Cool. That's interesting.
Okay, I can't find it in the middle.
It's the second line up from the third line up, third group up from the bottom. Call it paragraph.
That's right here.
Yeah, but finding it over there, it's down a little bit
Oh,
lower.
oh, okay.
yeah, they don't perfectly match up on the parallels. I'm sorry for that, but
That's fine.
Okay, so
Okay, Jesus. Yep.
yeah.
Oh, wait, right in front of my face, but okay.
That's usually the way it is after you search for it a while. It's like, oh, that's what it is. Okay, fine. All right, we're going to do the same thing that we did before, but now we have 3 words to work with. We're going to parse them and lex them. Parse them means we're going to look up the code and figure out what the different parts of the code means.
Maybe I don't mind, sorry, give me a second.
Okay.
Now I'm like, okay. I am seeing Greek.
Yes, you are. You are seeing Greek. You are not wrong.
Okay, I'm.
it's down lower than where the words are, and it's over towards the right-hand side of your little middle column. It doesn't say Jesus wept either. Just-
No, it doesn't. Mounts likes to, he's a little bit more dynamic on his translation sometimes.
Okay, there we go, that's where my problem was,
Jesus
okay.
burst into tears.
Okay, there we go, now I
Yeah,
got it.
I am not a big fan of Mounts' interlinear, to be honest. He's a little wordy sometimes, and he's a little dramatic sometimes.
This one. Where
Okay,
are they now?
right there. It says Jesus burst into tears, which makes him sound so human.
They put it all over here.
Okay, so
No,
there's that
he
word.
was both.
So with okay.
All right, so now we're going to go back to the wonderful job of parsing again. With that first word there, the 1233, our parsing code is the VAAI3S. And we should already know what the V means, but that was a whole slide ago, so we've probably forgotten. Verb, yep. Yep, so the V is verb. And then Mac, what does the A mean? I love these ones where I already put all the answers on the screen. It's great.
Oh, it's that first A.
Aorist, active.
Aorist.
Yeah, aorist is the first A.
Aorist.
Yep. The first A is the aorist. Got it. All
What
right.
is aorist?
You don't know yet.
Oh, okay, he's gonna let us know that.
And actually, if you want to be technically correct, you'd be aorist. People say aorist, and it bugs me. Aorist is actually how you'd normally pronounce it in academic circles.
Okay.
Okay. And then the second A is active. And then the I, before we get to the period, is indicative. And then we have a number before our next symbol. And we already saw that before as well. That's when you're getting into person and number.
So it's third person.
So,
singular,
yep.
right?
Yep. So 3 is third person, and then the S is singular.
We just have one number.
Yep. And then for this first word now, to figure out what it actually means, we need to look up the 1233 and figure out what on earth that means. And it will probably give you a little bit of a list of different definitions. I'm telling you which one is contextually appropriate, but look at the list and let's see what kind of different things we get there.
Oh, your number's Mrs. Stone.
1233. So
Mhm.
that would be to share two chairs or week.
Yep.
And you want us to write down.
We.
Yep.
That's the reference right there.
All right, so any questions about that first word?
That first word.
Pretty much took
Got
the
it.
whole verse.
All right, now the second word is easily my favorite word in Greek. It makes up about, oh, what is it? I think about 14% of the Greek New Testament just with this one word.
Wow.
Yep. And
Pos, right?
It's an
Is that pos?
No.
It's not pos.
ha,
Ha. Sorry. Ha. That's
Like
where
ha,
I'm
ha,
going.
yep,
That would be nominative.
yep, nominative. And then S is singular, and M is masculine. Greek words, unless it's like a preposition or a particle or something like that, most Greek words, whether especially nouns and things related to nouns, always have a gender associated with them. This one is one that happens to be masculine. There are forms of the word that are feminine and forms that are neuter and all those kinds of things. You guys will not have to memorize most of that because we're not going to go over morphology, but it's good to know.
That would be like if you're learning Spanish,
Mm-hmm.
they have the LA and the LE.
Exactly.
One's feminine, one's masculine.
Exactly. Yep.
Yes.
In fact, a lot of languages are like that. English is just kind of weird.
We say he, she. We say he, she. He's annoying.
Except we don't do that with objects.
Oh.
In Greek, it does it with objects.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, and I understand that because I think Spanish has a relative, yeah.
Yep. Spanish is similar to that.
Yes.
All right, and then we look up the code, the 3836, and I'll let you guys look up the code on this one because this is a very important code to know, and the way that Mounts handles it is rather interesting. So go ahead and look it up and see what it tells you.
Boy, it's got a lot on it. The prepositive article answering to a considerable extent to the English definite article, but for the principle and facts of this usage, consult a grammar. What?
Exactly. So in other words, I'm not going to give you the definition because this word is actually a word that's very flexible in Greek. So in my lexicon that I gave you guys at the beginning of your sheets, let's go ahead and look it up in there. So it should be on the second page of lexicon.
And the brief
Kind of.
Okay.
Yeah. And not the brief definitions, go further.
Oh.
Yeah, there you go.
Oh, there's all.
Yeah, so on that second page, it'll be right under the second darkened box from the bottom. So second darkened box from the bottom, right under that will be the ha.
Okay, under the second.
Versus
Okay.
the wish.
Oh, okay, that which is.
Mac, this one.
The next.
Yeah, you're fine. You're fine. There's and it's a problem, and it's partially my fault because there's two sets of definitions you guys have.
Oh.
There's the English definitions and then there's the Greek definitions. I should have said that this is the Greek definitions. I apologize. For those of you who are listening online, going through the material, it's the second list of definitions, not the first. My bad.
Okay, that's fine.
So you want.
That which is. He who is.
Yeah, he who
It
is.
doesn't say who is on this one, though. Oh,
He,
yes, it does.
He, she, who is.
He, she, is. Okay.
Yep. Yeah, I hate Mounts on that one because he basically capitulates on it and says, yeah, I'm not going to really go there because that word can be used lots of different ways. And my definitions that I gave you there don't encompass every single way that it works, but they will handle most of the ways that it works you can put in that
It
way.
will be the basic.
Yeah.
Okay. And so if we don't find it in the Mounts,
There's a reason why I gave you other resources.
we look in that extra sheet.
You can look in that extra sheet, and then there is his little book here, and it has a lexicon in the back that you can look it up in, and he'll actually give a definition in there. You guys can't really look it up in there yet because you don't know the Greek alphabet yet. That's why we have to have the next lesson, and then you can start using it.
Okay.
But yeah, he who is going to be the definition we're going to have to use there because Mounts didn't give us a very useful definition in the back of the interlinear. Okay, so I like a lot of Mounts' stuff, but there are some things where you look at his stuff, it's like, that's not useful.
Yeah.
That,
Did you say that?
that just doesn't work.
Just say, I don't know. No. And I'll go, gotcha.
Yeah, how is this supposed to help someone who's just getting into this? Well, it's not. I love the recommendation. Go consult a grammar. This is a grammar.
Yeah.
What are you doing? All right, so then we looked at, so we have weep and he who is. Fantastic. And then the final last word, we need to parse and lex. All right, when we parse this thing, it has the, its parsing code is n.nsm. And this one will actually be the same as the one that we just did. And you'll find this a lot of times with determiners and nouns. You don't need to worry about what that means right now. But there are certain classes of words that will just go together and they'll often have the same forms. The type of word will be different. One is a determiner. This one is a noun, but the part that follows will be exactly the same. It will be nominative, singular, masculine because it's referring to the same thing. Okay, so it's a different type of word, but what it's referring to is the same, so a lot of its components afterwards will be exactly the same as well.
And so the parsing is just giving you more specifically what that word.
It's telling you how it's going to work in that sentence.
Okay, how it's going to be used. Okay.
Yeah.
It's deeper than diagramming a sentence.
Oh, wait until we get... No, I'm not going to be that mean to you guys.
Thank you.
We will not do diagrams.
I need to go back over my participation.
And then we look up 2652, and we will check out what the definition of that one was. It's a relatively simple definition, though, and Mounts actually gets this one right.
He gets it right. That's for him.
You wrote the book, you better be right.
Savior, Jesus. And you want us to use Jesus, right?
Yeah. Yes, I would appreciate that if we use Jesus.
Jesus, he who is weeping.
Mm-hmm.
He who weeps.
Well,
I put an ing on it.
well, weep, he who is Jesus.
Weep, he.
But this one's aorist, the weep is, so wept he who is Jesus.
Wept
It's-
he who is Jesus.
Yeah, it's kind of like Yoda talk.
Yoga talk.
Yeah.
Yoga talk. Oh, so you don't have this.
That's another one of those unsanctified references I should not use when I'm teaching Greek. Just think of Yoda.
Okay, so do we have, because last time you said, what do you think this verse is saying?
You don't have that on this one, and that one's because one of these ones, its definitional form is not the same as the form it's being used in the text. The definitional form is weep, but it's actually past tense in the verb. Sorry, past tense in the verse. You guys don't know exactly where that comes in yet, so I'm not going to make you translate it yet because you don't know that. But if it did, I could. But the other one, the form that it translated from and what it meant was basically the same. Here, though, the tense is different. Weep is present tense. It's not present tense. And I will give you a hint. It has to do with this part right here.
We don't see that. You're not up
The
there.
aorist.
Yeah, right here.
Aorist.
Oh, there we go. I didn't see that. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know what that word means. I'll be looking that up when I get home.
Aorist, right?
Yep, the aorist.
Okay. So
Yeah.
what does that mean?
We will discuss that at a later point.
Look it up when you get.
No.
I have a dictionary this big.
Well, actually, it's in your brief definitions of parsing codes.
Okay.
Okay. Well,
So you don't want us to tell you what it means yet?
No,
Okay.
you guys already know how it translates. Jesus wept.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
This is the building blocks.
Okay. I know. I won't get the cart before the horse.
Yeah. All right, questions? Questions?
I don't think I have any questions.
I don't think so. I'm not really sure what I should have questions about. But
okay.
I don't think you should have questions. I don't know
Tell me what my question should be,
Yeah, go.
and I'll ask it.
Next week you might be bombarded with questions.
that's okay. That's okay. Did you guys get all of this written down?
I got all of that.
Yes, I
written
did.
down.
Okay, good. Because that's the end of that.
Okay.
All right, so you guys can use the remainder of our time together, about 15 minutes, to get started on the assignment. All right, and then for those of you who are online, that is basically the end of what's going to be useful for you. You guys can go ahead and get started on the assignment. Look in the description box at the bottom of the page. And thank you guys for listening.